Well, Ben, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I am excited to talk.
Absolutely. And today we're also joined by my friend Craig. And Craig, you actually introduced me to Ben's blog. So you kind of complete the circle here.
Yeah, glad to be
Thanks,
here.
Craig.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
Well,
Thanks for the intro.
yeah, absolutely. Well, Ben, could you give us kind of a brief bio and some of the big things you're interested in, the big problems you're working on right now?
Yeah, sure. So, briefest of bios, I am the CTO of Wave, which means that I lead the engineering team. And Wave is a tech startup whose mission is to make Africa the first cashless continent. And so maybe it would help if I explained a little bit about why that's a problem that I'm really excited about working on. And I mean, the short answer to that is that I think will have a really big impact on the lives of a lot of people to be able to use electronic payments instead of cash for various things. Now, that's a little bit of like a surprising claim. I guess if you've only ever used electronic payments, you might not realize that like using cash for various things is actually really bad and really inconvenient in ways that are like can be quite damaging. Um, and so I guess I'll give a few different ways that this can happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
That I think Wave is helping solve. So one, the most obvious one is money transfer fees. So if you don't have an easy way to send money by like moving bits around, then a lot of people actually end up spending really surprisingly enormous amounts of their income on money transfer. So in Senegal, if you look at, so Senegal is where Wave has the biggest presence. And if you look at our next largest competitor and what their like money transfer revenue was before we entered the market with much lower prices, it was actually like somewhere around like a percentage point of Senegal's GDP
Oh, God.
just on moving money from point A to point B, which if you're used to the money moving operation being something like decrease the bits here and increase them there, then you're like, why does it have to be, 1% of GDP just for this one service? And there were others that were also people were spending a meaningful amount of money on. And I mean, the answer is it doesn't. People don't spend that much money anymore because Wave is much cheaper. But that's just a very direct way in which we're saving people in Senegal like hundreds of millions of dollars a year that they can then spend on things that are really important, like school fees or medical care or whatever. It's not like they're people who typically aren't very well off, and so the money that we save them gets used for really really important things. Another less obvious way in which having electronic payments can be really really important to people is by saving them a lot of time. So like if you're a business person and you don't get a payment when you expect to get a payment, then maybe you run out of inventory and you can't sell things to your customers anymore. And then you lose a lot of income. And this was actually a huge selling point for Wave originally when we launched in Senegal, is that we put a lot of effort into making sure that our users could always get access to their funds very quickly. And as a result, a lot of our original users just saw their incomes increase a lot because they were like fish traders and they could do more fish trades because they could get their cash faster. And so that's another way that having access to electronic payments is really important. Now, maybe I'll give you one more, which is like the one that I'm most excited about, which is more of a longer term thing.
Yeah.
Which is if you look at all of the tech companies in Africa today that are succeeding, they're all fintech companies, and
Oh,
that's
interesting.
kind of like mysterious. Why is this? My theory about this is that the problem is if you, the tech company, are not collecting the cash yourself, there's no one else to do it for you. And this just makes it impossible to build many types of tech companies in Africa because the infrastructure isn't there. So if you wanted to build an e-commerce company, well, there actually is one of those that IPO'd, although I think it's doing pretty badly now, perhaps related to this, is if you're an e-commerce company, then you probably have to get your customers to pay you via cash on delivery, except in a few markets where there's like mature
Ah,
payment infrastructure. And that's just like adds a lot of friction to your business model.
absolutely.
And similarly, like in many other verticals, like there's so much stuff that you can't do because you can't really collect payments from your customers. So in the long term, I think that Wave or something like it existing in these countries will enable a lot of different types of businesses to be built that are simply impossible to build right now, and really contribute to helping businesses develop in all of these countries and helping the economy grow. So I guess for context on like quantitatively how important this is, Wave was inspired by a product that succeeded in Kenya called M-Pesa. And for various reasons, even though M-Pesa worked very well in Kenya, until now, nobody has really managed to replicate that level of success in other countries. But when M-Pesa succeeded in Kenya, a lot of economists looked at basically what was the effect of M-Pesa on people's incomes. And you can do this by looking at M-Pesa was rolled out throughout the country progressively, and you can look at the timing of when people got access to like the first M-Pesa agent in their town. And that varies. And so you can use that as sort of an instrument to figure out what was the effect of getting access to M-Pesa on their incomes. And based on that, they estimated that M-Pesa, the rollout of M-Pesa lifted 2% of all Kenyan households out of poverty.
Wow.
So that's just an enormous number of people. And this is like they crossed the World Bank, I think, extreme poverty line, which is like $1.50 a day or something. And so, right. So this is just like a massive effect on people's incomes. And, it was really surprising to me when I read that study. It was shocking, in fact, that something that seems so simple, like, replacing cash with electronic payments could have this large effect. But that it seems like the finding is like pretty robust. And, if you talk to Wave users, they're like really, really pumped about Wave. And that just convinced me that this is a really important problem to work on. And I think that Wave can have like a similar impact to that, like throughout the rest of the sub-Saharan African continent.
Following up on that, do you have any interesting sort of quick stories about the sorts of things you did to make money so accessible, just to get a picture of how it's impacting, the users?
So there's a lot of stuff that we've done that I think actually. So do you mean stories of like users using Wave?
Yeah, sorry. So I don't know why. Maybe I latched on too much to something you mentioned early on. But you said how one of the crucial things for growth and early on for you was making sure that they could always access their money very quickly, and that to me connected with how it could be so impactful or something like that. So I was just curious about what sort of things your company or Wave had to do to make sure that people could access their money quickly.
Okay, I understand. Yeah, so there are a lot of things that we do on this, and I would say this is one of the core problems, perhaps the core operational problem, at least, of running a mobile money company. So Wave has a network of what we call agents all throughout Senegal that our customers can deposit and withdraw their funds at. So in Senegal, we have over 10,000 agents right now, and managing that network of agents is an extremely challenging logistical problem. So there are thousands of them everywhere. Some of them are in very rural areas, and we have to constantly make sure that these agents have enough cash to serve our customers, not so much cash that it increases our capital requirements a lot, that they have all the supplies that they need, that they're staying open and serving customers when they promised to in their like business hours and stuff like that. And so this is extremely logistically challenging, and a huge fraction of Wave's team is dedicated to the sort of circulatory system of all of the cash between the agents. To be honest, I've lost track of all of the different ways that we do this now. There are like, we used to have a graph of like, here's how every agent exchanges money with Wave. And, when I started looking at that graph, there was like one way. And then at some point it forked off, and there are now like 10 ways. And so there are some agents go to banks, and some agents have intermediaries, and some agents go to other agents near them. It's a very complex problem. And I would say one of the most difficult parts, and one of the reasons that Wave is able to be so cheap, is that we've solved this problem better than other companies. And that we therefore have lower costs, and we can pass those on to customers in savings.
That's awesome. Well, Ben, I'm curious. You wrote in one of your posts that first you were earning to give, and now you're kind of kind of the EA stuff, and now you're working more directly on problems that have high impact. Is that a lot more rewarding than earning to give?
Yeah, definitely. I think I really underrated this before I started doing this, but I would say obviously it's more, maybe not obviously. It's more personally rewarding because, I can write a feature and design a feature and code up a feature and ship it to users and then see people use this thing that I built. And I can be like, yes, I built that and now these people are using it and they're really happy about it. And like, if you show up at somewhere in Senegal and you tell people that you built part of the Wave app, they'll be like really excited and like take selfies with you and stuff, right? So that's rewarding. I think a thing that I underrated more than even I underrated that aspect, but I think another underrated aspect of how this has been more rewarding is that I think that I just did much better work when I switched to working on something where I was really viscerally motivated by the root goal that I was working on. So gotcha. My previous job, before I worked on Wave, I was working on building machine learning models for a startup that used these machine learning models to purchase peer-to-peer loans on like lendingclub.com. They like ran a hedge fund because their machine learning models were better at predicting that these loans were not going to default. And gotcha. I joined this company because I thought it was going to be like a really interesting problem. I would get to read a bunch of statistics papers and like learn how to build machine learning models. Yeah. And like I did that and it was intellectually interesting, but at the same time, it was very obvious to me even at the time that my work was not attacking the core constraint of the company. Like their machine learning models were already pretty good. And their real problem was that they were having a hard time convincing people to invest in their hedge fund. And so in retrospect, I mean, I tried to do this a little bit, but I tried to do a little bit of hedge fund sales, but I wasn't very good at it because I was an engineer. But also, like, I didn't really care about running a hedge fund. And so my like personal incentives were not in the right place for this, and I just wasn't very effective. And instead, what mostly happened to me was I kind of got demotivated and found it hard to focus on my work, and probably didn't even do a good job at improving the machine learning models as I would have if I really cared about the output of them. And when I moved to Wave, even though my work was, I would say, most people would consider it to be less intellectually interesting, to build features in what is essentially like what engineers call a CRUD app. So an app where you create things, you read things, you update things, and you delete things, and that's all you do, and it's extremely simple. And so most people would consider that less intellectually interesting, although I would disagree. But even so, I think like I became much more effective as a person doing things just because I was thinking from first principles about what problem in the world am I trying to solve and what is the shortest path to solving it. And I wasn't trying to, for instance, I didn't care whether my job involved, reading statistics papers or doing accounting, which literally my job involved doing accounting for like months at one point. And, it wasn't, I'm glad that I didn't spend a lot more months doing it, but ultimately it was fine because I knew that the accounting was actually the most important way for us to achieve our goals.
Next thing you could be working on.
Yeah.
Got it.
And so as a result of that, I think I did much better work and became much more effective as like a person trying to achieve goals than I would have if I had been sort of more disconnected or alienated from the end product of the thing that I was working on.
Gotcha. And you may have just answered this question, but what general advice do you have that on selecting a problem to work on? And are there things people generally miss when they think about that?
Yeah. So the generalized handle that I have for this experience is that you should look for something that resonates with you, which is to say, like, that where you don't feel like you have to force yourself to do things that you don't care about, but that instead it's something that you're really like excited about and you're not internally conflicted about whether to work on it. Right. And yeah, I would say, I think most people in my experience, or certainly my personal experience, was I did not realize what was possible before I changed jobs and started working at Wave. I didn't realize that it was possible to have work that resonated so much. I think, especially as like a software engineer who cared about improving the world, I was like, well, obviously, all of the things that I look at where people say, oh, I'm doing software engineering and it directly improves the world. I was like, oh, these are all kind of bogus, right? Like people at Facebook think that Facebook is directly improving the world because like Mark Zuckerberg is really good at convincing people that Facebook directly improves the world. And like most people seem like they're kind of bullshitting themselves. And I don't really believe this. And so I decided to earn to give because I didn't think it was possible to work on something where I felt like basically everything that I was doing was aligned with was fully aligned with goals that I was trying to achieve in the world. And I think in both this and in many other areas, like I would say, I think people don't realize how good things can be, and so they settle. And I guess my generalized advice is like, consider not settling. I don't know. I think I would say also don't take it like, as with all advice that I give, I would say people should also consider reversing this advice. And in the sense that maybe I got lucky and maybe some people actually should settle, or like, maybe if you're listening to this, you're already likely to have received the advice, don't settle, like a lot. Right. And so you're already too far in the non-settling direction.
Right.
But like, if you hear the advice, like, things can be a lot better than they currently are, and that resonates with you, then maybe consider trying to make things way better than they are.
I want to unpack one thing. So I think you had the EA like lesson of that, like people can easily fool themselves about the impact they're having, right? So at the very beginning of that story was, you notice that lots of people, lots of software engineers have like fooled themselves about the impact that they're having because they're working at particular companies and that sort of thing. And so then it's like, that was the first step. How important do you think that EA, like really trying to think of your sort of what impact you're actually having in this career is?
I mean, if you care a lot about having an impact, I think it's incredibly important. And most people are quite bad at it, although maybe not most listeners to this podcast. I don't know, like, right. I don't know the demographics of your listeners. But yeah, I do think it's very, very easy, not just in choosing a job, but in most things, to convince yourself that you're doing something important, and turns out that that's not really true.
That makes sense. Going right off that, you wrote a post on life advice post. It's kind of a meta post. I really enjoyed it. Do you still read it every week? I believe you mentioned that.
Oh, you mean so this was a post of a bunch of links to essays of life advice that I read. Not literally those essays. I have had to change them up over time because, they get stale if you reread them, 5 or 6 times, and I could probably recite a lot of them from memory at this point. But I do still read, like, I have a list of like things that I read to like motivate myself to be more awesome. And I've just like found this really useful. I still find it useful.
That's awesome. Do any stand out in particular as having like a big impact?
So I would say it's actually less about the particular things that I'm reading. Like it's not like they're not obvious, right? In some sense, right. I shouldn't need Sam Altman to tell me like, don't put family low on your priority list. Like this is something everybody already knows, right?
Right.
And I think it's less about the actual the content and more about it's less about the content being novel and more about like continuously reminding myself of what is important. And I think that actually what is important to you varies a lot by person, right? So I wouldn't want to make like generic recommendations there, although I guess I kind of did with this blog post. But like I guess so the way that I think about this is I actually read a great blog post on this topic, which I will cite because it's like made an interesting point. It's called How to Read Self-Help by a guy named Tom Cleveland. And his point was basically this, that like people read self-help books not because they contain non-obvious insights. I mean, some of them maybe do, but most of them it's pretty it's stuff that you read and you're like, well, duh, of course.
Right.
But the reason that you're reading it isn't because you need to be informed of something that you previously did not know. It's that you need somebody to like kick you in the pants and be like, go be more awesome.
Right.
And that's sort of the point of these like life advice essays, is that like if I read these right before I do my like weekly review, where I think about the question of like, how could I have done a more awesome job in the past week? Not literally just my job, but also like personally in my life. And so it's really good to go into those weekly reviews in a state of like, yes, I'm going to become more awesome in all of the ways that, I don't know, Sam Altman or thinks that I should be more awesome or something like that.
How long have you?
But it's also good to have a mix of these, so that they don't get
Right.
stale, and B, so that you don't just become a clone of like one person.
How did you develop that like weekly meta habit of doing the weekly review and like getting these bottles of inspiration? Or
Oh, yeah. So I also wrote a blog post on this, so I guess we should probably put it in the show notes because it'll have a more complete picture. But I think I started doing these at the recommendation of Drew, Wave's CEO, and I think. And I just found them incredibly useful as sort of a way to continuously make small but compounding improvements to my personal habits over time. So every week it started out with like every week I would look at my rescue time report and I would be like, oh gosh, this week I spent a lot of time in Slack, and like, what if I spent less time in Slack by batching it instead of alt-tabbing to my Slack window every 5 minutes? And it turned out, after a few weeks of this, I was spending, I think, something like 50% less time in Slack and 50% less time in like scheduling tools generally, and like 50% more time on programming. And I was like, holy crap, I just became 50% more productive by like asking myself this simple question. And after that, it became pretty clear that like, yes, this is a thing that is like very useful and that I should keep doing. I would say, interestingly, I have found it to be a very hard habit to stick to, even though
Really?
I intellectually know that like it's very important. Yeah, it's just like, some weekends I won't be in the mood to do a weekly review, or like I'll like, my friend will invite me to have waffles at my weekly review time, and I'll be like, weekly review, waffles, like, hard choice.
Waffle time.
Yeah. And so, I've evangelized weekly reviews to a bunch of colleagues at Wave, who have also often had the same problem of like, oh, I know that I should do this, and yet somehow it's hard, and I always deprioritize it in favor of other things. So like, perhaps the most important thing to making it stick was iterating a lot on the format of the weekly review, and like what time I would do it at and what prompts I would use, and making sure that I set things up so that I wouldn't like slide off halfway through, just to make sure that I actually successfully did it every time. And if you're going to start a weekly review habit, I highly recommend like basically focusing most on like, how do you make sure that you keep doing it over time, and picking up if you drop it.
That's a great thought, and I've had great success. My wife and I do it every Wednesday night, so we have dinner together,
yes.
and then like
having an accountability buddy,
some kind
like
of accountability
that is,
buddy.
Yeah,
Quite helpful.
Yeah, that can be really useful.
It's cool. I think this is Craig's question, but I'm curious about it as well. There's so much to read out there. How do you filter out what's worth consuming and what's not?
Yeah. This is something I wish I had a better answer to. I think the only thing that I have started doing that I think was not obvious to me originally was to be very aggressive about not finishing things that I start, whether that's books or articles or something like that. Like, I used to be sort of a completionist about these things and think that it was immoral not to finish a book. And then I realized, like, life is short. And so, yeah, being really aggressive about removing, being more aggressive about skipping things if it seems like you're not getting very much out of them, I think is pretty important. Is there anything else that I do that's interesting? I think not relying on social media for things is something I would plug. So a lot of people used to use RSS feeds back when Google Reader existed.
Yeah.
When apparently nobody cared enough about RSS to go find another RSS reader when Google died, or when Google killed Google Reader, and I think that's pretty sad. But one thing that you can do now is Substack exists, and so you can subscribe directly to people's Substacks and not rely on the magic of algorithms to get you their thing. And there are a lot of really good Substack writers. But also RSS still works. And you can consume a lot of things by RSS, including Substack if you want. So I have an RSS reader. I use an RSS reader called Kindle for RSS that delivers all of the RSS items for a given day to my Kindle, and then I can read it offline and not get distracted by the internet and stuff like that. I guess I also often read this while going to sleep, and that really forces me to prioritize what I'm going to read, because I know if I'm reading something boring because I start to fall asleep. So maybe that's a life hack for you.
It does
anyway,
seem
but
one nice part of the feature is that you're it's not like an unending list of things to do. It's not like an infinite scroll or like an inbox. If you're relying on your inbox instead, then the emails keep coming and they keep piling up and that sort of thing. But if it's bundled every day in your Kindle, and then, you kind of have to finish that day's.
Yeah, that's definitely something that I really appreciate about it. I do still use social feeds some, and I guess I actually use Hacker News a lot. I mean, I hate Hacker News, but I also think it's a very good source of interesting things which I would not have otherwise discovered. And just as a piece of social technology is quite impressive. If you look at how crappy, for instance, Google search has gotten over the last 15 years, or kind of how hard it is to find good information on most things and how much they become gamed and become terrible. I think it's really, really impressive the degree to which Hacker News is actually still quite useful and interesting, despite it, I would say its many, many flaws. So I don't know. I do wish that there was a better way to consume these things without having a sort of infinite feed that you need to check a lot. And I wish this often enough that I'm considering writing my own sort of reading management app that works the way I think it should work. But I haven't gotten there yet, but maybe someday I'll take a long enough vacation that I can finish it. And yeah, I definitely don't think this is a solved problem.
Definitely. You've written a lot, you wrote a post about management. And what are some big takeaways, and how have you evolved over time? How has your management skill gotten better? And is there any takeaways we could garner from it?
Yeah, I have a few. So I think the first big adjustment that I encountered when I switched from being an individual contributor engineer to being a manager was the feedback loop is much longer. So if you're doing individual contributor engineering, right, somebody, asks you to help build a feature, and you design it, and then you build it, and you write the code, and then you test the code, and the code works, and you're like, great, my thing's going to work. And then you ship it, and then there's your thing. It's working. You're done. It went well. And that cycle can often take, a couple days at most. And there are, of course, intermediate points where you're you write your code and you basically know it works. And that part can take, an hour or something. If you're a manager, and especially if you've never been a manager before, most of your work isn't like that. You'll have a one-on-one with somebody and you'll give them some advice. And, 2 weeks later, they'll be like, that advice was kind of useful. And then 4 weeks later, they'll be like, I'm still thinking about that advice that you gave me. And then 2 months later, they'll be like, that advice, it was so good. And so it takes you a lot longer to learn whether the things you're doing are useful or non-useful. And that just, I think this is a common problem for people who transition from engineering to management, but it deprived me of a lot of my daily dopamine. And I kept asking myself, is this stuff that I'm doing even useful? If I disappeared tomorrow, would anyone care? And eventually I learned, I think most of what I learned was how to judge myself on process and not results. So instead of having to wait for somebody to be 2 months later, that advice was really good, I'd be I would finish the meeting and I would think to myself, yeah, I feel like I gave really good advice in that meeting. And I would be satisfied with that, even though I hadn't seen the full cycle play out. And I think that was an important mindset shift that helped me sort of cope. But it just takes a long time to have good enough models of what goes on when you are doing management that you can do that. And so it's like, it's a tough transition, and basically just one that I think you have to like be ready for and understand that you feel uncertain about whether your work is good now, not because you're a bad manager, but because this happens to everyone.
That makes sense. It's a big shift.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so that was the biggest shift. I would say another thing that was important for me, and I guess this is related, is just learning to be more patient. So I think I wrote a whole blog post about how great it is to be impatient. And I still think that it is really, I still endorse that post. Like, it's really good to ask yourself, how can things move more quickly and stuff like that. But if you're a manager and you're helping other people solve their problems, it's important to usually, instead of, for instance, jumping in to help them yourself, which over time will lead you to become overcommitted and everyone to continue to rely on you to solve problems, which is not what you want, because then you will not be able to scale. It's important to do it in the way that helps people learn how to solve their own problem instead. And so that was another big mindset shift for me. And then I think the third one, which is also, I guess, related to the above two, is the third one, which is related to the above two, is, I would say, trying to figure out a good way to put this. I would say that the third way that I've improved has been getting my own opinions out of the loop. I became a manager because in part because I was a very good engineer, and I often had opinions about what good engineering entailed. And when I first became a manager, those opinions were still mostly valid because I still had a lot of context on what was going on at the engineering level. However, as I have stopped contributing to the code base myself, and stopped doing most of the individual work myself, my opinions have become more and more stale and more likely to be incorrect. And so, as a protective mechanism against having incorrect opinions, I've always tried to, instead of telling people my opinion, ask a series of questions that cause them to realize what the correct opinion to have is. Nice. The advantage to this being, if my opinion is not actually correct, then they will answer the questions in a way that tells me that my opinion is incorrect. And so this is especially important because if you're in a position in the sort of a high in the hierarchy position, people will default to sort of assuming that you know what you're talking about, which is often extremely untrue. And so you have to figure out how to protect yourself from not knowing what you're talking about, because nobody else is going to do it for you. And so I guess figuring out how to ask questions instead of state things that people might not tell you are clueless was another thing that I think has made me a lot more effective.
Awesome. Yeah, that's cool. Unlearning some habits, habits that served you well as a software, as an individual contributor, appreciating that feedback, and then being impatient to try and kind of urge things forward at a quicker pace. And then, just building your intuitions and having good opinions. It's interesting that management for you, but the most important part of management for you was unlearning those habits that you had learned
definitely.
Yeah.
I love that. And I have a question. It's just for me pretty much, but anyway, we'll go for it. Keith Raboy, I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name, founded Open Door VC at Founders Fund now. He has this blog post, and he describes giving people only one priority at any given time. And I've used this, and it's really helped me, like in management situations, like, what's the most important thing, the individual contributor could be doing. And that's the only thing, like, we'll even talk about. Like, this is all that matters. And that's like been a really good way to like speed things up. Do you find, like, how many priorities is optimal at any given time? And it could just be like, I'm just a terrible manager and like, that's all I can handle. So I don't know, but I'm curious your thinking on this.
No, I think you're not a terrible manager. I think, in fact, you're a really good manager for only giving your reports one thing to work on. And in fact, this is something that's, I think, very deeply ingrained in Wave's culture. So, for example, if you ever talk to Drew, the CEO, and you give him a list of multiple things, he will immediately ask you, is this list stack ranked? And if the list is not stack ranked, the conversation will pause while you stack rank that list so that Drew knows what the most important item in the list is. And I think this, sort of the reason this is great is because most things you do in a company context are, I guess, distributed according to a power law. So maybe this is like a weird statistical digression, but I think it's really interesting and underrated. So I'll give you the mini version. But so things like human height are distributed according to a normal distribution. So like there's some average, and like things are clustered like pretty tightly around the average. The average for like height for men is like, it's either like 5'10" or 6 feet, and then like most people are within like 4 inches of that or whatever. Whereas the distribution for income between people is distributed according to what's called a power law. So like basically like the stylized version of this is the 80-20 rule, where like 20% of the people have 80% of the wealth, or something like that. Similarly, in a company. This is notably, this is a very different distribution from height. It is not the case that 20% of the humans have 80% of the tallness. It's funny to imagine what that would look like, where like, most people are like 6 inches high, and then there are like a few people who are like miles tall. Yeah. But that is not what it looks like. Anyway, so this is a kind of counterintuitive thing for humans to think about, because most things in the physical world are not power law distributed. But if you're starting a company, there is a power law distribution among like, what is the next possible thing that you could work on? You might not know what the thing is that is at the top of the tail and is going to, get you most of your users for the next month or whatever. But that thing is out there, and like, you should really only be working on things that you think could plausibly be that thing, and just focus really intensely and kind of ignore everything else. And so I would say that level of focus, which I would say seems maniacal from the outside, is definitely one of the things that has helped Wave succeed with a relatively small team in building a product that has a huge impact on a lot of people's lives, is just really being ruthless about only working on things that we think could be in that power law of like the 20% of things that will do 80% of the needle moving over the next month.
That's a great little cultural thing about the stack rank. I love that. Is there any other curious things about Wave culture that you'd like to share?
Maybe this is related to stack ranking. I think a lot of our communication happens in the form of bulleted, indented lists, which is maybe something that I didn't expect coming from a more academic background where people like their paragraphs and their complete sentences. But in fact, in my opinion now is that bulleted lists are much more effective, because they make the structure obvious to you instead of you having to reverse engineer the actual structure from somebody's paragraph. The other advantage, of course, is that if you have a bulleted list, you can use keyboard shortcuts to stack rank it really quickly, which is very important if you're stack ranking things like multiple times a day. I guess that's more of a quirk than a thing that's really core for us. Cultural things that are really important, I would say, we've always... So I think the most important thing is we've always hired basically exclusively for people who are really excited about working on our mission.
Nice.
And one reason for this, we've already talked about when you asked me, about choosing a problem to work on, which is just like, I think it's not unique to me that I do much better work when I'm really motivated by the end goal. I think this is true of most people. And so we really want people who will do amazing work, and that's much more likely if they're excited about the thing that they're producing and not just working with shiny technology or something like that. The second thing that I think is like maybe less obvious or more interesting about this approach is that it leads to a really, really aligned team that has, I think, very little like, internal disagreement or discord. And this just makes it really easy to work with anyone at Wave, because you know that if you have a disagreement with them, you're both trying to do the best thing for our users. And the only thing you disagree on is how to get there. And as a result, it's much easier for us to be like, oh, these people disagree. They should just sit in a room until they agree. And usually that works. And that works. And the decision they end up making is like much better. Compared to, my impression is that at many companies of Wave's size, there's quite a lot more internal politics and standing disagreements. And, people thinking that others are acting in bad faith or something. So obviously this is going to be hard to scale as we grow. But it's something that I really hope that we can preserve, because I think it's very common for organizations to really start having a lot of problems with this. And I think that Wave's compelling mission gives us an advantage that most companies don't have at sort of avoiding the typical descent into, I guess, maybe if I say descent into a moral maze, then everyone who has listened to your episode with Z will like know what I'm talking about.
I love that. I hadn't thought about, mission as like a certain hedge against, is some sort of hedge against like a descent into moral mazes like that. That's really well put. Well, Craig, do you have any other questions? Or if not, I'll jump into overrated, underrated.
All right, shaking my head. No, that sounds good.
Cool. Awesome. So I'll throw out a term and just tell us whether it's overrated, underrated, and why. Or maybe it's correctly rated.
Great.
Graduate school, overrated, underrated, correctly rated?
Yeah. Oh man, you really want a rant, don't you?
Yeah.
I would say graduate school is I would say it's overrated by like probably like 95% of people, and either correctly or underrated by like 5%. I updated on this recently. So first I'll tell you why it's overrated by like really, really overrated by most people. Which is, so I mean, the root reason is that the incentives are all messed up, and like as a result, so the way that I look at it as a manager is, of course, that grad students are individual contributors and their managers are just really like abjectly terrible. I think it's very common that your thesis advisor will basically not give you the time of day, that you'll have to email them multiple times to get like the most trivial of things from them. And that's just because you're basically a peon to them, and your productivity mostly like doesn't affect anything they do very much, and they're like absorbing the research. This is certainly not true of all advisors, but it's a very common experience and very, very bad experience to have an advisor who does not care about you and is sort of hanging you out to dry. Right. And like as a result of the fact that graduate students are incompetently managed, they have the same problem that happens to anyone who is doing something they don't know how to do and has an incompetent manager, which is sky-high rates of depression and anxiety. God. So you can look at the surveys of grad students and their mental health problems, and you will discover that the rate of depression among graduate students is approximately equal to the rate of depression among people whose spouse died 1 month ago.
Oh, God.
Jesus
Christ.
It's really, really bad.
Oh, no.
It's like, it is I would say like, it is a moderate humanitarian crisis.
Yeah, Jesus.
That is completely avoidable.
Gotta go rescue these people, gotta ride down to Duke and break them out.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm trying, right? I keep harping. Exactly. I will keep harping on this.
Working on it.
The harping will continue until grad student attendance rates improve. Right. Okay. So that's why it's incredibly overrated by most people. I think that like and then like I guess the other reason that it is overrated is because most people who are considering grad school only ask for advice from professors, and the professors are all like, you should go to grad school. It's great. You'll get an academic job for sure, which is totally false. And And they don't ask, for instance, fifth-year grad students who, if you ask them, will all be like, man, it sucks so much here. Never do grad school. And like, so there are all these like chipper, bright-eyed undergraduates thinking they have amazing chances on the academic job market. And then it's sort of the feeling of doom gradually washes over them. But by that time, they're in like year 3. And if they quit, they'd have like 3 years of sunk cost. And yeah, it's really bad. Anyway, I guess I should have cited my point of evidence for like the impact that this bad management has, which is my a former partner was a graduate student and had one of these, I would say, fairly checked out advisors. And he was like not a bad person. He was like, nice when they had meetings and like tried to be supportive of her. But also if she wanted anything from him, she would have to email him like 2 or 3 times. And like she gradually developed an UG field around emailing him because of that. Yeah. And so I observed this and I thought, like maybe if she had anyone giving her, so this is like management 101 is like, you should have one-on-ones with your direct reports, which is a meeting every week. It's kind of like a weekly review, like the one that you will do with your wife. It's like, what if I did this? So her advisor was not doing this. Yeah. He just like, I mean, maybe he would have if she asked, but he didn't set it up, which he should have. And so I was like, well, unlike her advisor, I care about her getting out of grad school, mostly because then she will be less depressed and then I will be less depressed. Right. And so what if I filled in for this guy? I mean, I'm not an academic philosopher. I don't really understand anything about my partner's dissertation, but I do, unlike him, have the qualification of caring a lot. Right. And so we started doing this, and I asked questions like, how's your email to that guy going? Have you sent it yet? And she would be like, I guess I should send it. And stuff like that. It was like very sort of basic, like management advice type stuff. And at the end of her dissertation, I asked her, like, were these helpful? Like, and she was like, yeah, like, I think they sped me up by like about a year in finishing my dissertation. Jesus. Yeah, which is ridiculous. Like, I was spending half an hour every week. I didn't know anything about philosophy. So I was basically just asking questions about like email and like, I mean, I was like, I was doing, to be a little bit more charitable to myself, I was doing a lot of like active listening. Like I would like rubber ducking, right? Yeah. I was basically her rubber duck. And like maybe I would ask slightly more mean questions than a rubber duck. Like, nice. Really, you should send that email, or something like that. But so it was, and I think that like I wasn't that replaceable because like I think it was important that I actually cared and wasn't just like checked out during those meetings or something. So. But anyway, I think it's completely ludicrous that I basically saved her a year out of like 4 that she had been working on that dissertation. Like, it's just like how many other of these incredibly smart people are wasting years, I don't know, like scrolling Facebook because they're dissociated, because they like don't know how to make progress on their thing, because they have an UG field around sending emails that like could be like trivially fixed by having a manager who cares at all instead of not caring. Right. Okay. So that's my rant.
Just caring matters a lot.
Yes. I guess I still owe you an explanation of why I think it's underrated. Yeah. By the other 5%, and maybe I'm overestimating the 5% thing, but I did see somebody tweet recently that all of my smart friends are now telling me that they don't want to go to grad school because it's about as bad as having their spouse die. Which I had 2 conflicting reactions. One is like, yes, I've created a meme. But the other conflicting reaction is like, I don't think it's actually true that literally no one should go to grad school. I think there are people for whom it is a good choice, and that they can actually have a big impact by doing academic research. I think there are like a few sort of predictors that you can use here to tell you whether, like, to what extent you should be worried about like grad school destroying your mental health. So one, obviously, as I mentioned, is like having an advisor who cares. And I think you can do a lot to figure out whether you will have an advisor who cares before actually selecting their advisor. But nobody tells you to do this. But like, you should really do it. So, I mean, ask their current grad students whether they are supportive and how supportive, and do you have weekly or bi-weekly meetings, and do they give you good advice in those meetings and stuff like that. And like, have you ever been depressed? If so, how did your advisor like handle it? Stuff like that. So that's one thing. I think there are also like some things about your personal situation that can make grad school like a better or worse decision. I think if you have an alternative to the academic job market, so for instance, if you're in computer science grad school, you can become a programmer.
Yeah.
This takes a lot of the pressure off because you're not worried about being totally unemployed if your like one paper fails to be a good paper or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's like one important thing. And then I think the other thing is having experience being effectively self-directed. So I think, for instance, I think I would be much better at being a grad student now than I would have been if I had gone straight after college. I don't really know how feasible it is to do, I guess, what I would call real work between college and grad school. I think this varies by field, and sometimes it can make you look bad for reasons that I don't really understand. But basically, if you have been thrown into the deep end of these things before and you've been like, yeah, I'm really fine, like taking initiative to like email my advisor, even though it's like pulling teeth to get a response that's useful, or like I'm really happy being like left to my own devices and I won't get depressed if I get stuck on a thing for a long time and don't have any idea how to make progress. I think that's like a good sign that you will be okay in grad school. And I think that generally like some of the things that people do in grad school like have a big impact on the world because they discover new and interesting stuff that then like, you know, helps develop new technology or whatever. And the last thing that I would say is like knowing why you're there and having like a very clear sense of mission, I think is the other thing. I think a lot of people go to grad school because they have graduated from undergrad and it's like that or a real job and they've never thought about the real job option. Right. And so like grad school, like no matter what you majored in college, you can go to grad school in that thing and it's a real option. And if you majored in something like poorly chosen, maybe you don't have any other options that seem high status. Right. And so that could end up with a lot of people in grad school who like maybe if they had thought through things earlier shouldn't have ended up there.
That makes a lot of sense. And Craig, do you have any thoughts on that as our resident graduate student in the group?
Oh, Ben,
are you a grad student, Craig? I'm sorry if I insulted your tribe.
Well, I'm doing, so I'm getting a PhD in economics from Duke. And I'm in my 7th year, and I definitely could have benefited from a fair amount of that advice. However, I've started working concurrently, so I got a job as an economist, and so trying to wrap things up soon, but definitely could have. There are some key things. I guess the things I would add my own experience to. I think the one you said about like being self-directed was the biggest one for me. I had worked before grad school. So I was familiar with that. But, you know, if you had asked me, like, when you have an independent project that's somewhat aversive, are you able to diligently work on it? Like, the answer would have clearly been no. And I think that, like, I learned how important that was over these past, 4 years or 5 years. So, yeah.
That's great. And I like what you said about, having meaning and like really think about like purposefully, like, what are you doing at each step just throughout your entire life, I think is a really valuable lesson to just try and do more of, just be intentional.
Yeah, I strongly agree with this. I think that like I've been noticing more and more the degree to which like it seems like I think everyone, like most people, and I would include myself in this, most people like underthink this, I guess, or spend like less time than would be optimal thinking about sort of what should I be doing and why should I be doing this? Probably because it's, as Craig said, like it's an aversive project that you have to work on independently. So in fact, like I've benefited a lot in the past from my friends nudging me to be like, oh, like it seemed like you were thinking about this. Did you make any progress on it? And I'm like, I didn't make any progress on this because it's aversive. Right. I feel like, have you considered thinking about it? Anyway, so yeah, I think that learning how to, I guess I would call, like learning how to stare into the abyss of like, what should I be doing? Am I currently doing the right thing? Is something that I've found to be really, every time I've leveled up in this skill, I've found it to be really useful and caused me to make much better decisions.
I love that. Richard Hamming, I might have found it on your website, you and your research.
I believe that is one of the life advice essays. Yes.
Okay, perfect. He had a thing where every Friday afternoon he would take the entire afternoon. It was like a quarter of his full working time and just sit there and try and think about whether what he was working on was valuable or not. and like
Yeah.
level set, which I don't know. Maybe a quarter sounds like a lot to me, but you know, not to be underrated.
I don't know. He was
He's
Richard
a smart
Hammond.
guy.
I mean,
He's
yeah,
a smart guy.
I think he got some good results from it.
Yeah.
And I would say like, yeah, it's I'll say I'm not surprised. I think that like if you important decisions take a long time to make, and like a lot of thought, and if that's how you're deciding to spend the next 5 years of your life or whatever, it's like a highly leveraged use of time.
Definitely.
One thing I want to echo too is just, as you said, staring into the abyss. I think one thing that was hard for me is like I gravitate toward quick problems, or just like problems where you can get that feedback and feel like you're making progress on them quickly. And it's like the things I have had to level up through the PhD. It's just like being willing to sit with frustrating situations that don't resolve in like 15 minutes of concentration. And so maybe the key is like to get to, his levels of success, you have to be willing to do it for 3 hours a week or something like that, of like really sitting and staring and focusing on like a challenging problem. But yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely something that makes it harder, is like it's not always easy to tell when you're making progress.
Right.
Because it can be sort of, it can come in lumps. Like you spend 3 hours thinking of something and you don't think about anything, or you don't think of anything useful, and then you spend 5 more minutes and you're like, oh, I've been thinking about it wrong the entire time, and like I really my stack ranking should have had this other thing in the number one spot, and now like I need to rethink everything based on the fact that my criteria have changed. And so if it's kind of like the act of staring into the abyss itself is like you're sampling from sort of a heavy tail distribution, and sometimes a lot of the time it's useless, and then sometimes it's like you realize that you should completely change how you're thinking about something. And so it's pretty demotivational, at least until you've done it a lot and seen that the results pay off. It's really easy to tell yourself, oh, this is useless, like I should just stop overthinking things and start and keep down my current path. But then I think this is actually something that I've learned to love, partly by working at Wave and seeing Drew, the CEO, who is, I would say, the person I know who is best at staring into the abyss, being like, oh, maybe we should completely change what our business is working on. So I guess an interesting part of the Wave story is that before they even started doing money transfer at all, the founders worked on 10 different social mobile apps and pivoted from each
really?
one. Which I mean, I think this has to be like a record of like largest number of pivots. They got really good at building mobile apps, but none of them took off. And so I think they just got very good at thinking, at realizing, like we have been working on completely the wrong thing for the last whatever. And this happened again with Wave, even after. So the original product of the company was international money transfer, like sending money from the U.S. to Kenya. And that thing reached product market fit. It reached like basically saturation in the US to Kenya market within a year. Like over half of all Kenyans were using the thing. And so it was like a hugely successful product. And the founders nevertheless realized that domestic mobile money, the thing that Wave is working on now, was like a much more important business. And basically they didn't completely pivot that time because like SendWave, the money transfer product was working. And so they needed to keep it around, but they pivoted basically 100% of their own attention to this completely unproven new product that then, so that was in like, I think like late 2015 or early 2016 that they started working on it. And then it took another 3 years after that for mobile money to get to product market fit. Which is just like, and of course now like the mobile money business is way more valuable than SendWave would have been. And so I think they've certainly been vindicated there, but it just took an insane amount of conviction to leave behind this business that was obviously good and be like, oh, this completely unproven thing, we are confident that this completely unproven thing is going to be much more important in the long term to our business, and we're going to give up on the thing that we know works. So watching them, and that wasn't the only kind, that's just the biggest instance of that type of decision. There have been like many smaller ones also. And so I guess like learning from Drew and Lincoln about sort of how to stare into the abyss and realize that you have been working on the wrong thing and be okay with that because you're making progress, has really helped me sort of internalize that mindset.
Right. And Ben, we're at the top of the hour, so if you have to go, just let me know.
I have more time.
Okay, good. My question is, so making that pivot right from send wave to internal money transfers, um, you know, like you said, it had to take like what's the internal story? Is the internal story like, clearly this is the right decision, like we're 100% confident this is going to work, or is it like, do you see what I'm saying? Or is it like, oh God, we think there's like a 70% chance it's going to happen. If we work really hard, we're going to go do it. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do.
I hope this part gets cut out. Sorry, it was a great conversation, Ben. I do have to go, but I
Awesome.
can't wait to hear the rest of this on the rest of the podcast. I'm really good chatting with you guys.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thanks, Craig.
Great. Thanks, Craig. Okay, so your question was, what was the internal messaging?
Or yeah, what was the internal feeling? Was it like really abundantly clear, if that makes sense, or was it like, we think we're pretty sure?
It was definitely not clear to most people. I think.
Gotcha.
I would say I bet that Drew was extremely confident that it would work. I don't know if he was 100% confident. I think he was 100% confident that it was the right decision. I don't know how, what his confidence was that it would actually work. But I do think he's often been much more confident than me that something would work and been right.
Gotcha.
So I think he had a very high confidence. My guess is that he had a very high confidence that if we tried hard enough, it would eventually work.
Got it.
And I don't know if he expected it to take longer or shorter than another 3 years to reach product market fit. Or maybe it was even 4 years or something. But I think his overall conviction that it would work eventually is has been borne out.
That's awesome. So I've got one more question for you, and it's a little bit of a pivot, but overrated or underrated? Bright lights in the home.
Incredibly underrated. I think. So the backstory here is that a couple of winters ago, so in Boston, the sun in winter sets at around 4:30 p.m. And I noticed that after the sunset, it became much harder for me to focus, and I was really resistant to just doing anything productive, and I kind of just wanted to curl up and read a book or something.
Yeah.
And so during one of my weekly reviews, I thought to myself, gosh, wouldn't it be great if I didn't have this problem and instead I could still focus in the afternoon, because then I could get more stuff done. And so I decided to try to simulate the effect of the sun not setting at 4, but instead setting later. And so I searched on Amazon for the brightest light bulb that you can buy.
Nice.
And I bought one, and it was it's super bright. It's the equivalent of, I think, around 40 incandescent light bulbs or something.
Wow.
And it's an LED bulb, but despite being an LED bulb and therefore pretty energy efficient, it still dissipates so much heat that the bulb also has an internal cooling fan to dissipate all of the heat that the LEDs are generating.
Yeah.
And you can't really look at it directly because the LED, it'll
Go
create
blind.
after images.
Yeah.
And so I rigged up some terrible light fixture, and there's a blog post on my website with the instructions for how to do this, which if you ever have trouble focusing in the dark, I highly recommend trying it out. But anyway, so I set this thing up, and basically I turned it on, and I was like, holy shit, I'm so energetic right now. And
awesome.
That was the point at which I knew that it was going to help solve my problem. And indeed, when I started using this light bulb, in the evenings, it became much easier for me to stay focused on whatever sort of high willpower or high attention task I was trying to do for much later. In fact, I realized that if I kept it on too late, it would become very hard for me to go to sleep. So I had to make sure that I turned it off at around 6:30 if I wanted to go to sleep at 9. Otherwise, I would be lying in bed thinking about all the stuff that I wanted to do. And yeah, so I would say during the winters, I regained around an hour a day of time during which I was able to do high intensity focused thinking.
That's awesome.
And it was just a huge benefit. I told a lot of people about this, and they were like, huh, sounds cool. But I think they were still underrating it. So if you're listening to this podcast, even after my spiel, you're probably still underrating it. For example, I would like have friends over at my house, and they would all say things like, "Ben, it feels so cheerful and inviting in here." And I'd be like, "Have you looked at the small sun on my bookshelf?" And they'd be like, "Oh, that's why."
It's Ben's son.
Or like, I gave one to my mom for Christmas because she also has like she actually has like, I think, more serious like seasonal moods.
Yeah.
And so I gave her one, and she called me to thank me, and she said like, gosh, like I put this in a room in the house that like people didn't usually hang out in, and now like mysteriously everyone is hanging out in this room all the time because it's like so much more cheerful. And so yeah, I think that like these super bright lights, just getting enough light has a really, really big effect on mood and concentration. And yeah, in fact, I believe so strongly in this that I keep trying to convince people to start a company that builds these lights in like a better form factor, because the one that I bought from Amazon is like, it's like really inconvenient. It's like super ugly. It's the light is like concentrated into a very small area, so you kind of like, you can't really look at wherever the light is. You have to sort of like, and then like it has this fan that's kind of loud, so it's like it's not really like nice. And I really want somebody to start a company that makes the nice version of these bulbs, where you can like put something on your ceiling and it gives like even really bright illumination like throughout the room. If I weren't working on Wave, probably I would like try to start this company myself, just because it's something that I like want to exist in the world. So maybe some listener to this podcast will like start that company. But definitely, failing that, everyone should get on the super bright light hype train.
Absolutely. Have you read Inadequate Equilibria?
Yes, I have.
Okay.
This was, I think, I had seen several other people make references to like really bright light bulbs, like helping with seasonal affective disorder. I think the thing that I realized, or that this is definitely part of what like inspired me to do this. I think the thing that I realized was like, you don't have to be depressed in order for this to be useful. I didn't have any mood symptoms. I was still like perfectly cheerful in winter. I just found it harder to focus in the evenings, and it was still incredibly helpful to me. So I guess I think about it as like, there's sort of, and this is in the blog post, but I think about it as sort of, there's like a bell curve of like, how much does light affect you? And if you're all the way off to like the like really affected by it end of the bell curve, then you like have seasonal affective disorder. And then your doctor will tell you like, put this light bulb right next to your eyeball, but like the light bulb's really like dim, and so it still doesn't do anything.
Still doesn't work.
But anyway, and so that's like, if you have seasonal affective disorder, then you should like definitely be doing this. But there are a lot of people who like don't have full-blown SAD, but like still could benefit from a better illuminated space. That's
super. I love that. I think it's really good advice, and it's one of those things, you might have mentioned this earlier, but it's simple, and somewhat like retrospectively obvious that like people like to be in the sun, and and that's more pleasant, but you just don't think about it in your day-to-day life.
Or like the even more like retrospectively obvious case is like, until humans became able to build these very large shelters, right? We were constantly in environments that even on a cloudy day were 10 or 100 times as bright as most indoor environments are today, right? So like, why should we expect that reducing the brightness by a factor of 100 would just be okay? Like, that's kind of surprising.
Absolutely.
So I don't know. I'm very shocked that I like didn't think about this earlier. But there you go.
That's cool. It's a great tip. Well, Ben, thank you so much for coming on. What's your blog's address? We'll put it in the show notes and everything as well.
My blog's address is benkuhn.net. It's BENKUHN as in November.net.
Awesome.
And you can go there. You can see some of the essays we've mentioned. Sign up for mailing list where you get future essays. And hopefully those will be useful to some people.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. Appreciate it.
Thank you. It was great to be on here. Really appreciated the great questions. And thanks again for having me.
Awesome.